The air in the archival sector of the railway depot carried the familiar scent of iron dust, ancient paper, and a faint, persistent tang of ozone from the distant, arcing power lines. Blake moved with methodical precision, each step across the reinforced concrete floor measured, each adjustment of a document or crate executed with practiced economy. The vast space, a cavernous chamber tucked away in the depot's oldest wing, housed a labyrinth of shelving units stretching to the high, grimy skylights. Here, the forgotten records of defunct rail lines, obsolete schematics, and the personal effects of long-vanished engineers lay in meticulous, if dusty, order. For Blake, this order was paramount. It was a bulwark against the inherent chaos of time, a carefully constructed system where every item had its designated place, its unique identifier, its story catalogued and preserved. They wore a gray, lint-free smock, the cuffs secured tightly over their wrists, and thin, archival gloves that offered protection against both grime and the acidic oils of human skin. Today's task involved the recataloguing of Section Gamma 7, a particularly dense cluster of turn-of-the-century cargo manifests. The rhythmic click of their barcode scanner punctuated the low hum of the ventilation system. A faint, irregular tremor vibrated through the floorboards, the passage of a freight train on the main line, miles away, yet its presence always felt. Blake hardly registered it, their focus absolute. They slid a heavy ledger onto their mobile workstation, its leather binding cracked with age, and began the slow, careful process of opening it, documenting its condition, and cross-referencing its contents with the digital database. The ledger contained a series of entries detailing shipments of industrial components to various regional hubs. Standard, predictable, unremarkable. This was Blake's comfort. As they reached the end of the Gamma 7 aisle, a discrepancy presented itself. A wooden crate, distinct from the uniform metal strongboxes and document cases that comprised the section, sat tucked behind a stack of empty parts bins. It was raw, unvarnished pine, scarred and splintered, with no visible markings, no stencil, no inventory tag. This was an anomaly. Blake's internal system registered an immediate, subtle disruption. Every item in Gamma 7 had been accounted for in the digital inventory for decades. This crate did not exist. They approached cautiously, not out of fear, but out of a professional archivist's instinct for the unknown, for the undocumented. The crate was heavier than its size suggested, resistant to the initial push. Blake braced their shoulder against it, a low grunt escaping their lips as it finally scraped across the concrete, revealing a thin layer of fine, dark dust beneath it. Not the usual depot grime, but something finer, almost like volcanic ash. Blake knelt, examining the wood. No nails were visible. The panels were joined with an intricate, interlocking system of dovetails, so precise they appeared seamless. Retrieving a small, flat pry bar from their toolkit, Blake sought a purchase point. It took several minutes of careful probing before a narrow seam yielded, revealing a faint, almost invisible line where the lid met the box. With a soft click, the lid lifted, not hinged, but sliding smoothly upwards and then off, as if greased with an invisible lubricant. Inside, nestled within layers of what appeared to be tightly woven, dark gray fabric, lay an object. It was small, no larger than Blake's fist, and utterly black. Not the matte black of coal, nor the polished black of obsidian, but a color that seemed to absorb ambient light rather than reflect it. Its surface was faceted, a polyhedron of impossible angles. None of the faces seemed parallel, nor perpendicular. The geometry was subtly, profoundly wrong, defying intuitive understanding. Blake reached for it, their gloved fingers hesitating just above its surface. They carefully lifted it. The weight was substantial, disproportionate to its size, a solid, dense mass that settled in their palm with an unnerving inertness. There was no texture beyond its smooth, light-devouring surface. No markings, no etchings, no discernible features. It was simply itself. A low thrum began, not audible, but felt. It resonated in Blake's bones, a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to originate from the object and spread through their arm, into their chest. The air in the archival sector seemed to thicken, the familiar metallic tang sharpening into something almost acrid. Blake's breath hitched. They felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to drop the object, to recoil, but their fingers remained locked around it. A wave of dizziness washed over them, brief but intense, blurring the familiar shelves into indistinct shapes. When it passed, the world seemed subtly altered. The edges of the concrete floor appeared sharper, the dust motes dancing in the skylight beams more numerous, more distinct. The low hum in their bones persisted, a new, unsettling companion. Blake tried to rationalize the sensation, attributing it to fatigue, to the unexpected exertion of moving the crate. But the object in their hand felt undeniably alien, an intruder in their meticulously ordered world. They placed the black polyhedron on the workstation, its weight indenting the archival paper beneath it. Blake stared at it, then at the empty crate, then back at the object. It defied categorization. And as they continued to gaze, the impossible angles seemed to shift, subtly, imperceptibly, as if the object itself were breathing, or perhaps, observing. The meticulous order of their world felt suddenly fragile. Blake moved with methodical precision, each step across the reinforced concrete floor measured, each adjustment of a lamp positioned over the artifact deliberate. The object, a dense, dark polyhedron roughly the size of a human fist, rested on a felt-lined tray. Its surface absorbed light rather than reflecting it, a property Blake had never encountered in any known material. Blake had discovered it nested within a forgotten crate, labeled simply miscellaneous unsorted, buried beneath decades of disused railway components. Its weight was disproportionate to its size, a silent defiance of expectation. For the past 2 days, Blake had dedicated every available hour to its examination, foregoing meals and sleep, the determination a cold, steady flame. They began by cross-referencing the polyhedron structure against every architectural, engineering, and geological record in the depot's vast digital and physical archives. The patterns etched into its surface, though shallow, possessed an unnerving regularity that hinted at design, yet defied classification. They were neither geometric in the Euclidean sense, nor organic in any biological context. Blake found no corresponding motifs in any known historical period, no similar material composition in any catalogued mineral. The object was an anomaly, a silent, inert contradiction. As hours bled into days, the depot seemed to shift around Blake. The hum of the distant generators, usually a comforting background drone, began to pulse, sometimes syncing with Blake's own heartbeat, sometimes jarringly out of rhythm. Blake dismissed these perceptions as fatigue, a natural consequence of prolonged concentration. Yet, the feeling persisted, a constant, low-frequency pressure behind their eyes. Blake's investigation led them deeper into the most obscure corners of the archives, sifting through microfiche records of forgotten industrial patents and hand-drawn schematics of experimental machinery from the early 20th century. Then, within a mildewed folder marked Survey Notes, Abandoned Mine Shaft, Sector 7, Blake found it. In the corner, almost an afterthought, was a symbol. Not identical, but unmistakably related to the patterns on the polyhedron. A series of interconnected nodes and lines, too complex for a casual doodle, too precise for random marking. The mine shaft, according to the notes, had been sealed due to unstable geological conditions and inexplicable atmospheric disturbances. No further details. Why would such a symbol appear in a mine survey? What could link a geological anomaly to an object of impossible design? Blake tried to discuss it with a colleague, a seasoned archivist named Eleanor, during a brief, forced break in the staff canteen. "I've found something," Blake began, gesturing vaguely towards the archival sector. "An object, and it seems to connect to some very old, very strange survey data. The patterns on it. They're unique." Eleanor stirred him lukewarm coffee, his gaze distant. "The old depot always turns up something odd, Blake. Probably just some forgotten industrial prototype. Or a bit of local folklore someone carved into a rock." She offered a dismissive smile. "You've been spending too much time down there. You look strained. Go home, get some sleep." Blake felt a sudden, sharp pang of isolation. The dismissal was casual, yet absolute. Eleanor hadn't even asked to see the object, hadn't shown an iota of curiosity. It was as if Blake's words had simply evaporated before reaching him understanding. Was it truly so outlandish? Or was Blake simply seeing things that weren't there, driven by the relentless pursuit of an answer? The thought was unsettling, a tiny crack in the foundation of their own perception. Back in the archival sector, the polyhedron seemed to thrum faintly, a resonance Blake felt more in their bones than heard with their ears. They spread out the mine shaft diagram next to a magnified image of the polyhedron's surface. The symbol from the diagram was simplified, less intricate, but the underlying topology was undeniable. It was a fragment, a partial representation of the object's complex pattern. Then, another discovery. A faded photograph, tucked into a structural report from the 1950s detailing repairs to the depot's foundation. The photograph showed a section of the concrete base, and clearly visible, almost etched into the curing cement, was a faint impression. The same symbol, repeated 3 times, as if pressed into the wet material by something large and heavy. Blake stared at the photograph, then at the polyhedron, then back at the photograph. The implication was a silent scream in the quiet of the depot. The object, or something like it, had been here, in the very foundations of the railway depot, decades ago. Not as an artifact stored, but as a presence. The inexplicable atmospheric disturbances, the unique material, the recurring symbols, they were not isolated incidents. They were threads, slowly, meticulously, weaving a tapestry of impossible connections that stretched across time and space, coalescing around this inert, light-devouring object. A profound disquiet settled over Blake, heavier than the object itself. The precise, clinical logic that had always guided them felt like a brittle shell, threatening to fracture. The world, the solid, predictable world of iron and concrete and paper, was subtly, terrifyingly, rearranging itself around this single, silent anomaly. And Blake was the only one who seemed to notice. The dismissal from the senior archivist, Eleanor, had been a cold, precise excision. It left Blake feeling hollowed, an empty vessel where understanding should have resided. The weight of the object in Blake's satchel felt heavier now, not just physically, but with the burden of an ignored truth. Blake's words, intended to convey urgency, had dissolved into the sterile air of the archive office, unheard, unacknowledged. This isolation fueled a quiet, rigid determination. If others would not look, Blake would look harder. If they would not listen, Blake would listen more closely. Blake needed a different kind of space, a vast, echoing chamber where the quiet hum of the object could resonate without the interference of human skepticism. The railway depot, long abandoned and largely forgotten, came to mind. The journey was a blur of urban decay and skeletal industrial structures. The city gradually receded, replaced by the hushed desolation of the depot's perimeter. Blake moved with a focused urgency, the heavy satchel swinging against a hip. Entry was simple. The interior of the railway depot was a cavernous expanse, a cathedral of disuse. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light that pierced the grimy windows high above. Derelict locomotives stood like petrified beasts on decaying tracks, their paint peeling, their machinery frozen in time. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of rust and the damp, earthy smell of old concrete. Echoes seemed to linger in the vastness, the ghosts of whistles and grinding gears. Blake found a relatively clear spot near a section of track that disappeared into the gloom, a place where the light was dim but sufficient. Spreading a thick canvas tarp on the grimy floor, Blake carefully extracted the object. Its surface, smooth and cool to the touch, absorbed the meager light rather than reflecting it. Blake took out a powerful magnifying glass, a portable lamp, and a fresh notebook. The study began methodically. Blake sketched its irregular contours, noting the minute, almost imperceptible etchings that seemed to shift under direct observation. Blake ran a gloved finger over the surface, feeling the subtle variations in texture. There was no clear pattern, no discernible language, only an intricate, alien calligraphy that seemed to defy human interpretation. As Blake focused, a subtle shift occurred in the railway depot. The distant, barely audible creak of settling metal began to deepen, to take on a resonance that felt less like structural decay and more like a vast, slow exhalation. The echoes seemed to stretch, to linger longer than was natural, carrying with them a faint, almost subliminal hum. Blake paused, listening, attributing it to the vastness of the space, the acoustics of the industrial shell. Not in response to the diminishing light, but with an internal volition. Blake blinked, shaking their head. Fatigue, perhaps. The stress of the last few days. Blake returned to the object, holding it closer to the lamp. As Blake's gaze intensified, the very lines of the depot began to waver. The parallel tracks seemed to converge at impossible angles, then diverge into an infinite number of paths. The metal girders overhead appeared to undulate, their solid forms momentarily dissolving into a shimmering, fluid state. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure that pushed against Blake's eardrums. A profound, silent roar seemed to fill the space, not with sound, but with an overwhelming presence. Blake's breath hitched. This was not fatigue. This was not a trick of the light. The object thrummed now, a low, resonant vibration that Blake felt in the bones of their hands, up their arms, into the very core of their being. It was as if the object was a tuning fork, striking a chord that resonated with the hidden frequencies of the depot, and of Blake's own perception. The revelation was not a sudden burst of light, nor a terrifying apparition. It was a complete, horrifying shift in the underlying reality. The metal walls of the depot no longer seemed like steel, but like vast, calcified membranes, pulsating with a slow, internal rhythm. The air was not merely air, but a thick, viscous medium, teeming with infinitesimal motes of pure, indifferent existence. The derelict trains transformed into colossal, inert organs, their rusted surfaces revealing impossible internal structures, veins of an unknown, ancient material running beneath. Blake saw the true nature of the space, a reality that had always existed, layered beneath the veneer of human construction. The railway depot was not just a building, it was a vast, cosmic chamber, permeated by something ancient and utterly beyond comprehension. It was not malevolent, not evil, but simply was, immense and uncaring, its scale rendering human existence an irrelevant flicker. Blake gasped, a raw, choked sound. The object slipped from their grasp, clattering softly onto the canvas. The world snapped back into its familiar, mundane form, the impossible geometries receding, the calcified membranes resolving back into rusting metal. The air lightened, the pressure easing. Blake scrambled backward, away from the object, away from the spot where reality had torn open. Sweat slicked Blake's forehead, and a tremor ran through their limbs. The railway depot was just a railway depot again, but Blake knew better. Blake had seen. The isolation was no longer just from colleagues, it was from the very fabric of the world, a world now revealed as a thin, fragile illusion. The object was not just an artifact, it was a key, and Blake had just glimpsed the terrifying truth of the lock it opened. The dismissal had settled in Blake's bones, a chill that no amount of frantic pacing or desperate rationalization could dislodge. Eleanor's words, precise as a surgeon's incision, had severed Blake from the comfortable delusion of order, leaving a raw, pulsing void. It was a beacon in the encroaching fog, or perhaps, a lure. Driven by a compulsion Blake could not name, a magnetic pull towards something forgotten and vast, Blake found themselves at the edge of the railway depot. The air here was thick with the scent of rust, creosote, and the faint, metallic tang of decay. Gargantuan sheds, their corrugated iron skins peeling like sunburnt flesh, loomed under a sky the color of bruised plums. Rails, slick with grime and disuse, stretched into the gloom, converging on an unseen point in the distance, a vanishing perspective that mirrored the dissolution Blake felt within. Blake stepped over a fallen section of chain-link fence, the sharp tang of oxidation filling their nostrils. It was a place designed for movement, for the relentless churn of industry, now rendered inert, a monument to a forgotten purpose. Blake pulled the satchel closer, the object inside seeming to vibrate with an accelerated intensity. It was here, in this vast, decaying space, that its true nature might finally unfurl. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from deep within one of the cavernous sheds, a sound like metal rending metal. Blake flinched, heart hammering against their ribs. It was likely just the wind, or a settling beam, but the sound resonated with the growing disquiet in Blake's mind. Blake felt eyes upon them, not human eyes, but something vast and ancient, peering from between the gaps in reality. Blake sought refuge under the skeletal canopy of a disused loading platform, its wooden planks groaning underfoot. With trembling fingers, Blake unzipped the satchel and retrieved the object. It was heavier than before, its non-Euclidean angles seeming to shift subtly in the dim light, defying the very laws of geometry Blake had always taken for granted. As Blake held it, a profound sense of recognition washed over them, not of the object itself, but of a deeper truth it represented. The edges of Blake's vision began to blur, the solid forms of the railway depot wavering like heat haze. The rusted rails no longer seemed to lead to a distant station. A desperate act of self-preservation, a frantic attempt to cut off the spreading contagion. He had seen the truth, or a fragment of it, and recoiled. Blake, however, had embraced the sickness. A wave of nausea swept over Blake, not from the stomach, but from the very core of their being. The railway depot was no longer a collection of decaying structures. It was a vast, intricate machine, its purpose incomprehensible, its mechanisms grinding away at the fabric of existence itself. The air thrummed with unheard frequencies, a chorus of impossible geometries folding in on themselves. Blake saw the true purpose of the tracks, not to transport goods, but to delineate pathways through the impossible, to chart the course of entities that moved not through space, but through the very structure of perception. Blake looked down at their hands, holding the object. They were no longer quite Blake's hands. The skin seemed stretched, the fingers elongated, the nails too sharp. A reflection in a puddle of black, oily water showed a face that was undeniably Blake's, yet subtly wrong, the eyes too. Wide, too ancient, filled with a terrible, dawning comprehension that erased all trace of individual identity. The object in Blake's grasp felt like an extension of their own dissolving consciousness. And through it, Blake began to perceive the true nature of the railway depot, not as a place of human endeavor, but as a scar, a wound in the skin of reality, through which something vast and indifferent continually seeped. The depot was not abandoned, it was merely dormant, waiting. Waiting for what? Blake no longer knew, nor cared. The question itself was irrelevant. Identity, purpose, meaning, these were human inventions, flimsy veils over an indifferent, all-consuming truth. Blake was a witness, a vessel, now utterly submerged in the boundless, crushing reality of what lay beyond the veil. The horror was complete, all-encompassing, and Blake, or what remained of them, was finally, terribly, at peace with it. The rumble of the freight trains was a low, constant thrum, a vibration that resonated through the concrete slab beneath Blake's worn boots. The railway depot stretched out, a cavernous expanse of steel beams, corrugated iron, and the pervasive scent of oil and cold metal. Blake clutched the satchel to their chest, the object within pressing a cold, persistent weight against their ribs. The dismissal, Eleanor's cool, surgical words, had left Blake adrift, but a new, terrible conviction had taken root. They were not mad, they were simply seeing what others refused to acknowledge. A lone, distant shriek of metal on metal echoed, the sound stretching and distorting in Blake's ears, morphing into something less mechanical, more organic, a slow, tearing sound, like fabric ripping from the inside out. They paused, scanning the empty aisles of the depot. No source. Just the familiar, industrial sounds, now imbued with a sinister resonance. Blake's breath hitched, a thin, sharp gasp in the chilled air. They had come here for a reason, a desperate, undeniable compulsion. This place, a junction of journeys and forgotten cargo, felt like the only appropriate stage for what needed to happen. They moved deeper into the depot, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The object in the satchel began to pulse, a subtle, internal tremor that Blake felt more in their bones than in their fingers. It wasn't a vibration, not precisely. It was a shift in the very air around them, a thickening of perception, as if the light itself was becoming viscous. The lines of the steel girders above seemed to waver, their rigid geometry softening, blurring at the edges. Blake blinked, shaking their head, trying to clear the haze, but the distortion persisted. An abandoned flat car sat on a disused track, covered in a fine layer of soot. Beyond it, a wall of stacked pallets formed a makeshift barrier. Blake felt drawn to it, an invisible current pulling them forward. Their determination, once a shield, was now a frantic, desperate plunge.
They needed to know. They had to know. Reaching the flat car, Blake unslung the satchel, their fingers fumbling with the clasp. The object, a dull, obsidian-like shard, gleamed with an inner light that seemed to absorb the dimness around it. It wasn't reflecting, it was consuming. As Blake held it aloft, the air in the railway depot grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The rumble of the distant trains ceased. The drip of a leaky pipe, previously a rhythmic counterpoint, fell silent. The entire vast space became utterly, unnaturally still. Blake felt their mind fraying at the edges, the carefully constructed walls of their understanding crumbling. The object was not merely an artifact, it was a key, a lens. Through it, Blake saw the depot not as a collection of steel and concrete, but as a living, breathing membrane, its surfaces rippling with unseen currents. The light wasn't just light, it was a weave of shimmering threads, each strand vibrating with an ancient, silent song. The very air was thick with the dust of forgotten time, a particulate residue of moments that had never truly passed. Then, the true horror revealed itself. It wasn't a creature, or a monster, or a thing with teeth and claws. It was the space between things. The walls of the railway depot began to breathe, not with a mechanical shudder, but with the slow, deliberate expansion and contraction of an immense, indifferent organism. The corrugated iron roof was skin, mottled and scarred, revealing the raw, pulsing sinews beneath. Blake was no longer standing on a concrete floor. They felt their own consciousness stretching, thinning, becoming translucent. Their thoughts, once coherent and distinct, now fractured into a million shimmering fragments, each one a tiny, screaming universe. The truth was not something that could be comprehended, only experienced. It was the silent, indifferent presence that had always been there, just beyond the edge of human perception, a vast, formless consciousness woven into the very structure of existence. And Blake, by uncovering its fragment, by daring to look through the lens, had become attuned to its frequency. Their body remained, a silent, unmoving statue on the flat car, the obsidian shard still clutched in a hand that was now strangely translucent. But Blake's mind, their very self, was no longer contained within the familiar confines of bone and flesh. It was everywhere and nowhere, a whisper in the echoing silence of the railway depot, a newly woven thread in the vast, indifferent tapestry of the horror. The horror had a new, silent witness, a fragment of itself, watching from within the dissolving walls of reality.